Well, hello there and welcome to African Perspective. I'm Tsepiso Makwetla. On the 18th of July, the world will observe Nelson Mandela International Day as the country of his birth, South Africa, celebrates Mandela Month. The icon once said, like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It's man-made and it can be overcome and eradicated by action of human beings. We reflect on his legacy this month and how it's encouraged development and globalization. In other news, first, the African Union Commission is calling for an independent investigation into the bombing of a detention center in Libya, where over 40 people are reported to have been killed. Libya remains an internal conflict as the UN-backed government of National Accord and the Liberation National Army have failed to find a truce. The latter is now using military means to try and take control of the capital, Tripoli. Coletta Wanjoyi reports from Addis Ababa.
So far, nobody in Libya has claimed responsibility for the bombing, which the United Nations has described as a possible war crime. Most of the 44 killed and over 100 injured are believed to have been from sub-Saharan Africa. Smugglers regularly transport migrants through Libya in order to make the dangerous crossing over the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. When he visited the country in April this year, the African Union Commission chairperson Musa Faki Mahamat requested that the detained illegal migrants be treated with dignity during the conflict period. Since 2017, the African Union, European Union and the United Nations have enabled the voluntary repatriation of 33,000 Africans from Libya. The African Union is yet to set a date for a planned reconciliation conference between the two parties in Addis Ababa. As African heads of state meet later this week in Niger, Libya is likely to be at the top of the agenda. I'm Coletta Wanjoyi for SABC News in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
On the same matter, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has expressed outrage at the raid on the detention center in Libya. Mentioned it's claimed more than 40 lives and injured more than 130 others. Guterres condemned in what he says the horrendous incident in the strongest terms. He's called for an independent investigation. Several other senior UN officials have indicated that the attack could amount to a war crime, as the UN Security Council is set to convene in a closed-door emergency session this evening.
This is the government-run migrant center before it was hit, overflowing with Africans who use Libya as a transit point in their attempts to reach Europe. This satellite image shows the center before and after it was hit.
The Secretary General is outraged by reports that at least 44 migrants and refugees, including women and children, have been killed and more than 130 injured following airstrikes at the Tajura Migrant Detention Center east of Tripoli. He condemns this horrendous incident in the strongest terms, and he expresses his deepest condolences to the families of the victims and wishes a quick recovery to those injured.
The attack has resulted in the highest publicly reported death toll since Eastern forces under Commander Khalifa Haftar launched a surprise offensive against the UN-backed government of National Accord in Tripoli.
The Secretary General calls for an independent investigation of the circumstances of this incident to ensure that the perpetrators are brought to justice. It is important to note that the United Nations had provided exact coordinates of the detention center to the parties. The Secretary General further reminds all parties of their obligations under international humanitarian law to take all feasible precautions to avoid and in any event to minimize incidental loss of civilian life, injuries to civilians, and damage to civilian objects, and also to refrain from directing attacks against civilians. This incident underscores the urgency to provide all refugees and migrants with safe shelter until their asylum claims can be processed or they can be safely repatriated.
The United Nations Security Council will meet in an emergency session later Wednesday. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, said that depending on the precise circumstances, the attack could amount to a war crime, particularly after the coordinates of the detention facility had been communicated to the warring parties. This is also the second time the center, which houses around 600 people, had been hit during the current hostilities in the country. And while the Security Council will meet behind closed doors later, consensus around how to proceed on Libya has been difficult to reach among the 15 members. Sherman Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
To East Africa, where Kenya this week offered another land grant to South Sudan to woo her southern neighbour to use its upcoming port of Lamu in what is seen as a way to lock out competing neighbours, Djibouti, Sudan and Tanzania. President Uhuru Kenyatta offered 10 acres of land to South Sudan for a dry port in the western town of Naivasha to act as a logistics hub during a state visit to Kenya by South Sudan's Salva Kiir. Early this year, Kenya offered Uganda a dry port in the same area.
The dry port will see South Sudan cut the amount of time it uses to get its goods from the port of Mombasa, as well as the time taken to clear the goods. This is the second country after Uganda to be offered a land grant in the town 90 kilometers from Nairobi. Uganda is the biggest client of the port of Mombasa. The land grants are seen as Kenya's answer to competitors eyeing to snap up landlocked countries in the region.
To ease the movement of goods consigned to South Sudan, the Kenya government has responded to the request of South Sudan to set aside 10 acres of land at the inland container depot in Naivasha Industrial Park for use as a dry port by the government of South Sudan.
Our discussions also touched upon important infrastructure projects between our two countries and contribute to the regional economic integration.
Kenya also agreed to mobilize international support for South Sudan's revitalized peace process. President Kiir was in Kenya on a 2-day state visit. Sarah Kimani, SABC News.
South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa will tomorrow witness Lesotho political parties sign a memorandum of agreement that will ensure a free passage from all stakeholders, committing towards a successful SADC reforms process. Following much instability that rocked the Mountain Kingdom, the SADC intervention has recommended President Ramaphosa as facilitator to oversee successful implementation of security reforms, parliamentary, judicial and media reforms, amongst others, as a matter of urgency.
With the SADC heads of government meeting in Tanzania around the corner, both the government and opposition have a responsibility to ensure successful implementation of the reforms process. And President Ramaphosa, with the aid of retired Justice Dikgang Moseneke, are tasked with ensuring that all stakeholders are on board.
Tomorrow morning we'll have a press conference at which we will disclose the full terms of the agreement, and so that they are transparent to all Basotho and indeed to the world.
And who are we likely to see witnessing that ceremony, that agreement, if it is?
Well, His Excellency the President Ramaphosa will be coming through tomorrow, and I'll be pleased and privileged to be able to receive him here as we conclude a very difficult journey and just about to adopt actual substantive reforms.
And we're confident as we go to SADC Summit, we will have some positive news to present.
Yes, I think we will have positive news to make available to the Heads of State Summit, but we're working hard at it.
President Ramaphosa will also spend time during his one-day working visit to revive a joint bilateral commission for cooperation, JBCC, which was first established in 2001. The JBCC between Lesotho and South Africa spans, but not limited to, a wide range of areas of trade, investment, security, agriculture, water, as well as environment. Rapelang Khatebe, SABC News, Masego, Lesotho.
Mama, tell me a story.
My child, I have a great story to tell you. Although we come from humble beginnings, we've done legendary things.
South Africa have won the 1996 African Cup of Nations.
Our lands are full of wonders. Even though sometimes things don't go our way, we find inner strength to persevere and push forward. We dress up for the occasion. Oh, how we love to dance and sing. We've seen our fair share of victories and disappointments. But we thrive when we are together. And that, my dear child, is the beautiful story of Africa.
SABC is the official broadcaster of AFCON 2019, Africa's beautiful story.
On Full View, the end of the day means unpacking the day's events. We recap all major news stories from around the world.
The African Union's decision to suspend Sudan's membership was made by the AU Peace and Security Council.
It was a unanimous decision. We said we'll give them up to 60 days.
And have in-depth discussions on what's happening in our country.
This economy, for it to grow, you need people that will be working in order for them to be able to have the buying power.
So as we celebrate Mandela Month,
as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest. Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. And overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It's the protection of a fundamental human right. The right to dignity and a decent life. While poverty persists, there is no true freedom.
In his own words, Nelson Mandela, and as we celebrate Mandela Month, we remember his values and principles. The Nelson Mandela Foundation has launched a new strategy for Nelson Mandela International Day, which was declared by the United Nations in 2009. The new approach is titled Mandela Day, the next chapter. The foundation's chief executive, Sello Hadang, says Mandela Day has grown and is now active in over 200 countries. He says the new strategy charts a new path in significantly changing the manner in which it will impact people's lives. So the next 10 years will see the establishment of a global network of change makers to ensure deeper and sustainable impact in response to global challenges of poverty. Joining us now to talk about this in line with the United Nations Agenda 2030 and its SDG goals is UNDP resident representative Ayodele Odosula, who is in studio with me. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's really a pleasure to be with you, SABC.
So just as I mentioned there in the introduction, the new approach, do you think this is evidence, especially from a United Nations perspective, that it's moving away from being an ad hoc Mandela Day singular act to long-term collaborative strategy?
Well, I think it is a very solid approach in using it to drive the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Mm-hmm. The Agenda 2030 can only be achieved with some kind of dedicated leadership like that of Mandela. Otherwise, we will not be able to achieve it. Once we have a kind of strategic approach of leadership and management at the country level, it will give us the opportunity to really move in the right trajectory. And I'm happy enough that about 200 countries are now celebrating Mandela Day. We don't want it to be just an activity. We want it to be a kind of movement that is used to drive the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which we call Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development of the United Nations.
I'm just thinking, having come from the United Nations as recently as now, you would know that the evolution from the MDG goals, one of the biggest things that was found was a lack of reliable data, especially when we talk about poverty. How do we resolve that?
Well, I agree with you completely. Data is one of our major challenges, even with the implementation and measurement of the Sustainable Development Goals. But what I think is that once we have a kind of commitment from national and subnational government, we will be able to get there. Looking at the statistical agencies in all African countries where adequate budget has not been provided for them, in terms of delivering their mandate, generating national statistical data and information that will help us to monitor the progress on the SDGs. And once we change that trajectory, drill to the kind of leadership we're looking for in terms of having what we call passionate leader like Mandela, dedicating adequate resources for national statistical agencies to generate national data that will be able to use in monitoring the progress on the SDG. I know it is possible. We need this not only in terms of what we need to do at a national level. We're calling on all development partners, international development communities, to support the generation of data and statistics for the monitoring of the SDGs. And I'm saying this in particular because we want the African government to be fully involved, because whoever generates the statistics dictates the narratives of development.
But it's also about interpretation or understanding how we process what poverty is, what inequality is, and as you say, it speaks to the kind of leadership. Do we have that kind of leadership from a global approach even?
From a global perspective, we have the kind of leadership and dedication that can take us to that place. We are all celebrating the achievement of Goal 1 under the MDG era. This was made possible by countries like China. That's the kind of leadership. They are dedicated to making sure they move everybody out of poverty. We can do it in Africa as well. If several countries have done it in moving people out of poverty. Ghana was able to really move a substantial number of people out of poverty during the MDG era. And we have a number of countries that have initiated the progress as well. And we have few countries like Burkina Faso who succeeded in reducing both poverty and inequality over the past 2.5 decades consecutively. It shows that it is achievable. We can do it in Africa.
I'm just curious because looking at the recent G20 summit and obviously fighting poverty, there's an interconnectedness from the various initiatives from an international standpoint and regionally within the continent. Certainly, SDG Goal 1 and 10 were not high up on that list of what the G20 countries are aiming to achieve.
Well, the G20 countries are just to really create the global momentum. And I strongly believe the African Union, too, has shown that they want to create a kind of shared prosperity in the continent. And if you look at the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, it shows that shared prosperity is what everybody's really aiming at. And I think with that kind of dedication, with the kind of movement that has been generated in terms of having a kind of global consensus on the need for us to end poverty by 2030, it is achievable. We are calling on the international development community to be more focused on it. But what I just want you to know is that it's not only when poverty is mentioned, and that's where the issue is addressed. When the issue of quality education is mentioned, you can use it to dent poverty in our countries. When the issue of job creation is used as the driver of the SDG, you can use it to dent poverty in African country. When the issue of access to sustainable energy is used, because these are the multipliers of the SDGs. These are the multipliers and accelerators of poverty reduction. Once we focus attention on them, we are indirectly addressing the issue of poverty.
And I'm glad you mentioned that there is a collaborative methodology in attacking and reducing those SDG goals 1 and 2, but I mean 1 and 10, but we mentioned earlier on the lack of data. So if we're talking about Africa being the poorest continent in the world, what are the figures and what are we using to measure those?
Well, I don't believe Africa is the poorest nation. I know when we look at the monometric measure of poverty, then we can say that. But when we look at the total, aggregate, it is not so. Africa, I see Africa as the next growth pole of development in the world. And you will see within the next 10 or 15 years how Africa will occupy its center place. What we are really preaching is to promote quality growth. Over the past 15 years, in spite of the global crisis we had, Africa happened to be the second fastest growing region in the world after Asia. And again, if you look at out of about 12 countries in the world that are driving the growth momentum, about 6 of them are from Africa. And these are the kind of things we need to use in shaping the growth trajectory of Africa.
But you would agree with me that a lot of those countries are the most insecure and the center of conflict, and therefore losing on making those gains on reducing poverty and inequality. And the fact that they're vulnerable means that as a whole, we suffer as a region.
Definitely, there cannot be development without peace. And when you have a lot of conflict, definitely it will reduce the pace at which you want to attain growth and development. And that's one of the things we want to really use in following the African Union's objective of silencing the gun. And we're calling all African countries, the international communities, to really make sure we focus attention in making sure conflict in Africa becomes an issue of the past.
So you mentioned earlier on, obviously, about the multi-pronged approach to poverty reduction. So it's not just about a lack of income, it's also about sustainability. You mentioned health, you mentioned education. Is there also collaborative effort? I know just from an economic perspective, we're talking about the free trade agreement, but is there enough cooperation amongst African countries in reducing some of these challenges? Because sometimes the most poorest countries have the most innovative solutions.
Thank you very much. The fact that Africa has agreed to really adopt the Continental Free Trade Agreement is a very good development. Development is in the sense that it has become the largest trade partnership we have in the world. And what we need to do is to make it happen. One of the major things we need to look at is using trade to drive development in Africa, because it is the trade aspect that can promote inclusive growth and development. And the fact that we have it is now going into full force in terms of implementation, it shows that the momentum to really achieve it is there. The beauty of it, I'm so glad that it's happening at this moment, when the world is getting, the rest of the world is going into disarray. We experience what is happening, the Brexit initiative in Europe, and you look at the Trans-Pacific Atlantic Trade Initiative that is going into, to pieces, whereas Africa is coming together to really make sure they forge a way forward in promoting what we call integrated trade.
I want to talk about other social protection systems. Climate change has become a major issue. One of the trustees of the Nelson Mandela Foundation mentioned that that's something that we also need to tackle. It's becoming more and more of a reality for Africans now, especially with the recent cyclones, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and in Malawi.
Thank you very much. One thing we know very well that has become the reality on the continent and in the world is the climate change, the impact of climate change. Unfortunately, Africa contributes least to the issue of carbon emission, green gas emission, but it has one of the worst impact in the world. And again, it has the limited capacity to cope with this impact of climate change. What we need to do is calling on the international community to really help to address the issue. The impact of the cyclone Idai in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi has shown that the poor countries don't really have the capacity to really cope with it. We need to really have a kind of solidarity approach, not only from African dimension, from the global dimension, to support the countries.
So UNDP, what is your approach, especially within Mandela Month? What projects are you hoping to embark on to make true this dream?
Thank you very much. One thing from the UN perspective, especially in South Africa, this morning we have a meeting with the media, and one of the things we said is that let's use this month to dedicate it to Mandela, and on the basis of this, let's dedicate it to addressing poverty. Let's initiate a kind of collaborative effort that will help us to really dent poverty on the continent. And we're calling on the African leaders to imbibe what they call the ethical leadership of Mandela, so that we will be able to drive development through effective governance, responsive governance, and governance that are able to promote what we call the quality of growth and development.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. UNDP resident representative here in South Africa, Ayodele Odosula. And that's how we come to the end of the program. So children have always been very close to the late Nelson Mandela's heart, and as we continue to celebrate his legacy and reflect on his life throughout this month, we close off tonight's show with these two young, talented brothers from all of us here. Good night. Thanks for watching.
Oh, me, my brother, damn lie, the keyboard, yes, playing keyboard for me today. Yeah.